and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. As John said, I sort of wear two hats at the moment, but if you had any questions in your mind as to which capacity I'm speaking in today, the PowerPoint slides on either side of the room should make it fairly clear that I'll be speaking in my capacity as a professor today, and focusing on what I think is a really interesting set of issues around how to increase the size of the pie in Australia. And there's a sort of another talk that I could give on distribution, which I think is critically important. But for now, I want to focus on just how we improve growth in Australia. I'm pretty unabashedly of the view that growth is good for many respects. Larger economies are able to be more generous to their neediest citizens. They're able to be more generous to people overseas. We have some pretty nice psychological research now suggesting that a steady increase in living standards over time is integral to much of what we take for granted as human beings. Growing societies seem to be happier societies. It's hard to point to a place in the world where the income levels aren't getting any higher and where the people are happy. My colleague Justin Wolfers has just been crunching data from a new Gallup survey, and he's able to show Gallup is now surveying people in 150 countries around the world on an annual basis. Justin looks at their income levels, and then he looks at their response to Gallup questions like, how often did you smile yesterday? Were you treated with respect yesterday? Did you laugh yesterday? Did you experience physical pain yesterday? And all of those things are correlated very, very strongly with income levels in different countries. So I think for many of the sorts of outcomes that we care about, for the sort of deep utility that economists talk about, growth matters. How do we get to growth? The Krugman line that's on the screen is the neatest summary that I know of. Productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. And I think that then brings us to the new agenda now in Australia for boosting productivity. Following on from the sort of competition reforms of the early 1990s, I would argue that the new area of reform, we'll skip over what our income levels, the new area of reform is in the area of information. I know this is an issue that Nicholas is going to touch upon. Don't make the post hoc ergo propter hoc mistake. Just because I'm speaking before him doesn't mean that I didn't actually steal some of the material when he sent me his PowerPoint slides beforehand. But hopefully we'll be able to divide up the information debate. I'm going to talk about information in three contexts. In terms of measuring outcomes, using the example of school test scores, in terms of good information on the efficacy of programs, using the example of randomised trials, and I'll finish on a cautionary note, avoiding overconfidence, being aware of the limits of what we can know about the future. And I'll use the example of job projections. So in terms of measuring outcomes, one of the things that I think is increasingly going to be critical to be able to do is to measure the productivity of our public services as best we can, and use that information in order to improve the way public services serve people, and particularly serve the most disadvantaged. This agenda has been pursued vigorously by the Rudd and Gillard governments under the My School reforms, and also thinking more rigorously about how to get information about hospital performance. What I'm going to talk about here is research that's joint with Chris Ryan, which tries to look at how Australian schools have performed over a very long time period, going back to the 1960s, 1970s. And we're going to be looking at kind of a narrow measure of school performance, literacy and numeracy. Clearly this isn't all you would want a great school to do. A great school should instill children with a sense of self-confidence, civic understanding, with an ability to rigorously question what they're asked. But it should also teach students to read, write and add up. Literacy and numeracy aren't everything that schools do, but they're an important thing that we would want a great school to be doing. And what Chris and I do is we identify a set of tests which were administered over a very long time span, where the same questions were asked of children in the 60s and 70s and today. And looking over, I say today, we've got up to 2003. So this is a very long time span, but part of what happens when you do historical analysis is you end up stopping a few years earlier than the present. And we find a small but statistically significant fall in numeracy from the 60s to the early 2000s, and in literacy from the 70s to the 90s. That may not be so tangible to you, so since Mike has warmed you up to have your brains focusing on lots of interesting issues, I reckon it's time to do a maths problem. So, in the division 24.56 divided by 0.04, what is the correct answer? Take a moment to work that out, and then I'll tell you the share of children in year 8, 9 who got this question correct over time. Hands up for A, 0.614. B, 6.14. C, 61.4. D, 614. E, 6,140. Or F, didn't know, 0. Right. So the correct answer is 614. You can think of this as sort of an order of magnitude kind of question. It's about like saying what would happen if you multiplied 25 by 20. And you want an answer somewhere in that ballpark. Back in the 60s, 39% of Year 8 students got that right. 70s, 38%. 1995, 23%. And yeah, that's it. So from the 1960s through to the 1990s, the share of students correctly answering this question nearly halved. Going on now to a question about averages. Joe had 3 test scores, 78, 76 and 74. Mary had scores 72, 82 and 74. How did Joe's average compare with Mary's? Joe's was 1 point higher. Joe's was 1 point lower. Both averages were the same. Joe's was 2 points higher, and Joe's was 2 points lower. And the answer is both averages were the same. Fraction correct. Back in the 60s, 88%, the 70s, 83%, the 90s, 74%, 1999, 74%, 2003, 68%. So the share of Australian students correctly answering this question has also fallen over time. I've just shown you a very narrow snapshot. There are other questions which seem to flatline over this period. Questions of, in a broad sense, computational skills seem to have fallen. Problem-solving skills have flatlined. If you look at literacy, grammar skills seem to have fallen. Critical thinking skills have flatlined or maybe even risen a little. Across the board, though, the picture is roughly of flatlining. To the extent that there's been a drop, it's not a catastrophic drop. It's in the order of a couple of months of schooling. But what we didn't see over this period from the 60s to the early 2000s was an improvement in the literacy and numeracy of Australian students. And it didn't seem that this is something that's occurring at a single point in the distribution. It's not as though we suddenly had a spike in very poorly performing students or it's all as though it's all happening at the top tail of the distribution. If you think in terms of statistical distributions, the student distribution has just shifted a little to the left, the way you wouldn't want it to be moving. And that's also true of schools. It's not as though we see schools bifurcating into a very low performing and a very high performing group. School level averages have just shifted down a smidgen. And when you think of that in IQ points, something in the order of a tenth of an IQ point a year, which contrasts with the growth in test scores that we saw in the post-war decades, most made famous by James Flynn's results, which showed that IQ scores to a large extent rose in the post-war period. In this period from the 70s through the 90s, we seem to have seen a flatlining or a slight decline in contrast to the sort of standard Flynn result. So I think this information is important, and getting more information into the system can help to drive reform.